In the last episode of this series, we looked at the model of posture that we use, as that is what helps us both create directions and recognize when we're orchestrating the movements as we intended. We looked mainly at the torso, so today we'll look at the limbs. In terms of posture, the popular ideas around how the arms and legs should be used are largely wrong. With the arms, the totally backwards idea that is quite widely believed says that you want to pull your shoulders and arms back. This superficially appears to broaden the chest at the front, but this is done by narrowing the shoulder blades together on your back. It will also tend to cause you to push your abdomen and lower ribs forward in exactly the way we want to avoid. If we come back to what we looked at concerning the torso, we saw that there is a tendency for the midsection to be pushed forward, which hollows the back. We can also understand this as the top end of the ribcage and the lower end of the pelvis being pulled back. This bows the torso forward in the middle. Even people with so-called forward head posture have the top of their ribcage pulled back, and it's the severe angle between the backward lean of the upper ribcage and the forward lean of the neck that produces the characteristic look. We can also look at so-called PPT posture, named after posterior pelvic tilt. While there's a slight difference here, in that the lower end of the pelvis is not pulled back, the pelvis as a whole is still pushed forward. The upper ribcage is also still leaning back, and the hollowing of the back is still present. So while there is undoubtedly variation in posture out there, this bowing of the torso is the central problem. If this is not corrected, nothing else you do will matter all that much. With this understanding, we can figure out what's going wrong in the limbs as well. The arms are connected by the shoulders to the top of the ribcage. So we see that people pull the top of their ribcage and their shoulders and arms all back. This causes a sort of closing and narrowing at the back of the armpit. This is easily observable in most people, yet the common advice out there suggests the exact opposite is the problem, and they suggest you close off and narrow your armpit at the back even further. We can also see that the pelvis will be pushed forward in this configuration to compensate for the retraction of the upper torso. So how will that affect the legs? The legs connect into the pelvis at the hip joint, so when the pelvis is pushed forward, the outsides of the legs are pulled back relative to the pelvis. We again get narrowing at the back of the joint, very similar to what happens to the arms. The torso essentially splays forward, and the limbs become narrowed and cramped at the back. The big advice around the legs that is quite wrong in my view is to keep your knees bent. People seem to act as if there are only two modes for the knees. They're either bent or they're locked up to be stiff. But we want to straighten the knees, which can be done without locking them. Ligaments and tendons in the knees, legs, and really the whole body need to be taught to function properly. These connective tissues function similarly to fascia. They need due tension. If you constantly bend your knees, you will shorten your legs, just like if you constantly bend your torso, you will shorten your torso. You will also make your connective tissues slack. You will lack tension, and so you will overwork the musculature. The thing to be careful of, though, is that many people have a habit of pulling the lower part of their knee back to try to straighten the knee and the leg, when really what most people need is to pull the top of their thigh back in space. That is what will straighten the leg out and bring the weight to the back of the knee where it belongs. So now let's look at some practical considerations concerning the limbs that will be relevant in both your day-to-day life and when you're specifically working on your use of self and posture. When it comes to the arms, we want to use them in a way that leads to extension and not shortening. A quick example of this is that if you ask a person to hold a stick and to put it under their armpit, they will often turn their elbow back and tuck the stick like this, as opposed to extending the arm to point the top of the stick under the armpit. The shortening gesture is easier for people to do, so that is their first inclination. That's what's habitual for them. But whenever we use the arms in our practice, we want to be extending the arms, as that is what will help us widen the upper back and make the fascia taut. If you ask someone to put their hand against a wall, they will often extend their arm straight out, which typically results in a lifting of the arm, whereas pulling the tip of the elbow out and down will produce more lengthening. It will often even cause a real feeling of stretch. These might seem like little things, but they all just point at our habits. Most people will habitually shorten their arms and torso anytime they do anything with their arms. By having a clear idea of what it means to get extension of the arms, and really the upper back, you can shift these underlying habits, and in time, totally change both your posture and how you use yourself. With the legs, there is a similar issue with extension. Often when people are seated, rather than placing their feet flat on the floor, they will curl their feet up in one way or another. Many people will struggle to get their heels down to the floor if they don't move their feet forward after sitting. This stems from habitual shortening movements that retract the heels and legs up towards the torso. When you sit, you want to have your feet flat on the floor, but you don't want to move them forward to make that happen. In this series, we've looked at the idea of moving the pelvis and midsection back in space. This will shift your weight to be more into the back of the leg and heel, whereas most people tend to have their weight driving down through the front of their knee and their toes. When we shift weight back, it's common that people will end up lifting their toes up off the ground. This is something to typically be avoided. Occasionally there is a procedure specifically for lifting the toes and standing on the heels, but when this lifting of the toes happens in an unwanted situation, it's happening for one of two reasons. First, it can be a lack of extension in the lower leg and at the ankle joint. When the leg goes from leaned forward over the foot to leaning back away from the foot, you will be stretching the lower leg if you keep your toes down. So you really want to keep your feet on the ground when experimenting with shifting your pelvis and midsection back. But when you do shift your weight back, that can challenge your sense of balance, and often when people feel like they're falling back, they lift their toes. This is an irrational habit, since lifting the toes will only make you fall back faster. It would make more sense to press your toes down if you didn't want to fall back. Using conscious guidance and control is all about changing your habitual reactions from irrational shortening movements to reasonable lengthening movements. In the next episode of this series, we'll look at how to practice on your own to change your use of self and posture. But these ideas can also be used in your day-to-day life. Most of us use our arms to do a lot of different things throughout the day. Do you find yourself pulling your elbows back and in when you use your arms? Can you instead give yourself the directions to pull the tips of your elbows out and down to make the movements needed to extend your arms as you use them? See if you can incorporate some of these ideas in your day-to-day life. Then join me next episode, and we'll look at how we can work directly on our posture and use of self.